Ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good afternoon for those of us in the Eastern European time zone. My name is Mikko Lievonen and I work at the Kalevi Sorsa Foundation in Helsinki. It is my pleasure to open this webinar co-hosted by the Kalevi Sorsa Foundation, Arena Gruppen and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Our topic today is right-wing populism and COVID-19 in Germany, Sweden and Finland. Roughly 1 year ago, Europe plunged into the COVID-19 crisis. Amid the initial shock, we saw widespread fear, panic, but also solidarity and political unity. That moment, however, has now passed. To borrow from Shakespeare's Richard III, now is the winter of our discontent. Despite numerous predictions on the imminent demise of right-wing populism during the pandemic, populism is still here. Populist parties in different European countries have assumed different strategies. They have reacted to the crisis and they have adapted. Depending on the context, populist parties have thrived or waned. The purpose of today's discussion is to compare 3 Northern European countries, Finland, Sweden, and Germany. They each have strong right-wing populist movements. Each of them has taken a different path during the pandemic. This seminar arises from a research project conducted by our co-host Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. The project compared populist movements during the COVID crisis in numerous European countries. I can warmly recommend the research outputs arising from this project, which are now available online. On behalf of the Kalevi Sorsa Foundation, I also wish to extend my thanks to Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and Arena Gruppen for the collaboration that brought us this webinar. I should especially like to thank Josephine Fürst from the FES for acting as the prime mover behind all this. Now all that remains for me is to introduce our moderator, Verena Stern. Ms. Stern is a research associate and PhD candidate at the Faculty of Sociology at Bielefeld University. She previously held positions at the University of Vienna and was a research fellow at the Austrian centers in Edmonton and Minneapolis. She is also the author of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung's comparative report that this webinar derives from. I hope you find today's discussion enlightening. Once again, welcome. And Verena, I now hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this introduction, and hello, and thank you all for coming. Just a quick update on the comparing paper that I wrote on the Profiteers of Fear. It will be downloadable for free shortly. So this is a quick update. Before we begin, I wanted to give you a quick overview of what will happen in the following hour. So in the first segment, we will hear about the Finnish, the Swedish, and the German cases. Second, we will have time for a brief discussion with the presenters. And last but not least, we will have a concluding remark. And on Facebook also, the audience has the option to comment during this presentation and feel free to ask questions. We will try to pick them up later in the discussion if there is time for this. So first, we will hear from the Finnish case by Niko Hatakka, who is also the author of the Profiteers of Fear country report on the Finnish case. And he is a research fellow at the Department of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Birmingham. And I will give over to you now. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Verena. So the current situation in Finland is that the Finnish government is for the second time currently trying to engage a state of emergency. So that will be the second time since the end of the Second World War when this has happened, the first time being last spring. So despite things have been relatively good in Finland, the situation is getting worse. In the spring of 2020, we had only around 200 deaths, whereas now the death rate has risen to around 800, and we have around 60,000 infections altogether. Don't get me wrong, the situation in Finland is comparably better compared to many other European countries, but definitely the Finnish center-left government is facing increasing political pressure at the moment. Now, throughout the crisis, the Finns party, which is the only populist radical right party in Finnish parliament, has been rather moderate and consensual regarding the handling of the virus. Especially the central party organizations' responses to the handling of the health crisis, they have remained very calm. And on its official platforms, the party's institutional leaders, they have even regarded most of the government's actions either as necessary or even vital. So unlike in Germany or in the United States, on the level of established political institutions, there hasn't been any kind of a widespread right-wing populist protest against the restrictions issued by the government. So in fact, in some perspectives, the Finns party has even demanded for further restrictions, like has happened in Sweden with the Sverige och. For example, the Finns party, they were among the first ones to push for a comprehensive national mask recommendation that still remains to be issued by the Finnish government. So instead of challenging the government strategy head on, the Finns party has relied heavily on pointing out, for example, flaws in how the government has communicated its actions. And throughout the year, there certainly have been plenty of inconsistencies and mistakes to criticize. Now, when it comes to citizen movements, the virus has not significantly mobilized the Finnish far right. One of the reasons for this is that the extra parliamentary far right in Finland has been sort of weakened by infighting between the several small and organizationally very weak and non-unitary movements. So unlike in Germany, in Finland, there haven't been notable citizen protests or demonstrations against the health officials issuing of recommendations or restrictions. And this is important in a sense that this has meant that there hasn't been these already mobilized and popularized symbols and platforms for the Finnish far right to co-opt and to engage in protest with. And this has also definitely discouraged individual Finns party activists and the party's local chapters from also participating in these kind of party adjacent actions. So despite there have been clear-cut conspiracy theories regarding COVID-19 circulating, especially in Finnish far-right online publics, the Finns party's actual engagement and most importantly, the party's perceived affiliation with these kinds of pursuits to disseminate this information have remained very thin, if not completely strenuous. So in the initial stage of the pandemic, the party leader Jussi Halla-aho, for example, urged party members and activists to ease up on unnecessarily chastising the government and to kind of sticking to what he called factual politics. However, as the party's online presence relies heavily on these decentralized online communications, this also means that the party's individual politicians and activists have been able to utilize more confrontational stances and styles in criticizing the government's handling of the crisis. Regardless of this, and for example, regardless of the fact that the party has just accumulated around 5,000 new municipal candidate election candidates for the municipal elections that are just coming up next month, the party has still been able to avoid widespread journalistic and civic scrutiny that would have targeted individual Finns party members and activists' participation in disseminating this information online. Now, one of the explanations for why the Finns party has shown such restraint in how it criticizes the government is related to how the party has this ongoing pursuit to regain its legitimacy as a reliable governmental partner in the eyes of the Finnish center-right. So instead of trying to incorporate these kind of entirely new conspirational ideas that are to a certain extent ideologically incompatible with the party's current ideological form, the party has very much focused on its core issues, those being immigration, EU criticism, and opposition to the so-called climate hysteria or environmental regulation. So, and what is really important about this is that the Finns party has done this very consistently by rewiring the party's core ideology through economic discourse, and not any economic discourse, especially right-wing discourse. So as the Finns party has adopted economically right-wing positions and has completely embraced the Finnish center-right party's rhetoric concerning, for example, the dangers of public debt and spending, this has pretty much driven the National Coalition Party into crisis. So the National Coalition Party, which is the rightmost of the Finnish center-right parties, has been losing voters to the Finns party for some time already. And because of this, the Coalition Party has also increasingly been adopting nativist and authoritarian policy positions regarding especially immigration. And this tension between the liberal and conservative elements within the National Coalition Party has been made evident, especially in the activists' online discussions. It has revealed significant problems regarding the sort of organizational coherence and ideological unity within the coalition party. But in terms of the Finnish populist radical right, the Finns party is doing splendidly. In terms of the party's support, initially the party took kind of a hit in the acute phase of the crisis when it lost around 6 percentage points in its popularity. But throughout the crisis, because of its consistent communications and sort of staying clear of any kinds of conspirational ideational content, the party has been able to rebound back to being the #1 polled party in the country. So in the paper that I wrote for the Frihet Stiftung, I suggested that the Finns party has made these strident efforts to try to close down the gap between the Finnish center-right parties and the Finns party by adopting this kind of more right-wing economic positions. But now it appears that the coalition party especially is definitely returning the favor for the Finns party. So in terms of party politics, one of the most significant results of COVID-19 in Finland, I would say, is that the Finnish center-right and the populist radical right have seemed to be reforged their trust towards each other. And this is extremely good news for the radical right in Finland.
Well, thank you, Nico, and also thank you for keeping the time. I will present you now the second presenter, Ann-Cathrine Jungar. She's an associate professor in political science at the Department of Social Sciences at Södertörn University in Stockholm. Her current recent research deals with right-wing populism in Europe, with a specific focus on the Nordic countries, and she's also the author of the Swedish country report of the Profiteers of Fears, which you can, as well as the Finnish and the German cases, you can download for free on the Friedrich Ebert Foundation's website. Ann-Cathrine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Verena, for the introduction, and thank you all for letting me present my part of this project on the radical right-wing populism and the corona. Sweden obviously acted differently than most other European countries in combating the pandemic. Instead of strong legislative measures or lockdown, the authorities opted for a voluntary strategy. So every day, still now, we can hear the chief epidemiologist, Anders Tegnell, representing the Public Health Agency, telling us to wash our hands, keep a distance, work from home if possible, and not to travel unless we have to. And the society has been kept open as far as possible. More restrictions have come over time, but enterprises and schools have been open. And the aim has obviously been to control the spread of of the virus to protect the most vulnerable from the virus and keep the hospitals not, keep sure that the hospitals are not overcrowded. Nevertheless, in the Nordic comparative perspective, I mean, Sweden has until now has about 13,000 deaths with COVID, which is far higher than in the neighboring countries. But compared to other European countries, the excess death rate in Sweden is not that high. But given this background, the populist radical right party in Sweden, the Sweden Democrats, have been presented with quite a different opportunity structure than the Finns party in Finland. However, they have also employed the key elements of their ideology, that is populism, authoritarianism, and nativism, in trying to criticize the government from their actions. Until April, all political parties in Sweden were in a way supporting the government, not criticizing the government. But as the number of deaths increased, the Sweden Democrats were the first party to start making opposition against the government on the basis on fighting the government. And first of all, it was kind of the populist arguments, criticizing, having these kind of anti-establishment arguments against the government. Criticizing them for not taking sufficiently measures, not protecting the elderly. Jimmy Åkesson, in the first public opinion piece in Dagens Nyheter, if I don't remember wrongly, called it a massacre. And also in the parliament, there were a lot of criticism from Sweden democratic parliamentarians of the government not being able to protect the elderly. And obviously the response was the authoritarianism. They said, well, why doesn't Sweden do like other European countries, close down, lock down? And the Sweden Democrats have, until recently, when also the Conservative Party, Moderaterna, suggested that face masks should be increasingly used. And there are obviously recommendations on face masks in some parts of Sweden, in some regions. So that resonated with the Swedish democratic core ideology, authoritarianism, also to close borders. There have also been suggestions of not welcoming asylum seekers and so on. There have been less of nativist elements in the criticism of the Sweden Democrats towards the government. But there were discussions on that there have been a slackness in relation to language requirements among those who work in the elderly homes, and that should be, and that's a criticism that the Sweden Democrats have made previously, and now they have been joined by other political parties. There were also kind of arguments that, well, elderly care shouldn't be kind of used like integration experiments, providing jobs for those who do not have the right competence to work there. That was kind of implicitly saying, well, immigrants have been able to work there without having the right competence. But on the other hand, one could say that those who have been mostly targeted or suffered by the COVID is in the immigration in parts of Sweden, and particularly in Stockholm, when the immigrant population is high and where there is where the housing conditions have not been good for preventing the spread of the COVID. Well, the Sweden Democrats, they were on an all-time in their opinion polls in 2019, as they have not been able to talk about their core policies like immigration and integration and criminality, since the pandemic has outcrowded for a long time all other political topics. Their support dropped to kind of what they received in the parliamentary elections in 2018, around 18%. On the other hand, what has been kind of the benefit from the point of view of the Sweden Democrats, which they have aired in the public sphere as well, is that they have been normalized. And the government had their weekly presentations of the situation, what measures to be taken. The Sweden Democrats have been invited with all the other political parties. This has not been the case previously, since there is this kind of cordon sanitaire or isolation of the Sweden Democrats that has been maintained for a long time, but now seem to be loosening them up. So that's and the relationship with the main conservative party, Moderaterna, has developed, and now the Moderaterna has joined the Sweden Democrats in criticizing the government in their handling of the pandemic and the measures taken that relates partly due to the economic measures that have been presented on how to tackle the consequences of the pandemic. So one could say that this pandemic has contributed to an already ongoing normalization of the Sweden Democrats, and also reflects that the other parties, particularly conservatives, but also the Social Democrats, after the refugee situation in 2015, started adopting some parts of the Swedish democratic discourse on immigration and integration. So I think the pandemic has, in a way, speeded up this process. As to the presence of conspiracy theories, I have mainly dedicated my paper to the Sweden Democrats, and there have been reports made on the spread of conspiracy theories in the public sphere or also among the social media, and researchers have been quite surprised that there have been so little of it. And there was also a report made by public opinion researchers in Gothenburg, and they made a survey asking the Swedish citizens to what extent they believe that the corona was kind of a ordinary virus, or if it was kind of a biological weapon. And it was 13% who agreed with that kind of conspiracy belief in the pandemic as being produced and manufactured in a way to destabilize the society. The Sweden Democrats were kind of overrepresented in this group, but it was only 1 of 10 Sweden Democratic sympathizers that agreed to that, and that could be compared with that 6% of the Social Democratic voters believed in that. So I think the conspiracy theories are not primarily found among the radical right, but can be found among other social groupings, particularly those who are involved in the anti-vaccine movements. But the radical rights have not, at least publicly, tapped into this environment from what we can see so far. So I think I've been keeping my time here, so for my 10 minutes. So I will return for the questions and discussions afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ann-Cathrine. So our last presenter today is Nicholas Potter, who will give us an overview of the German case. And the German country report is also available for download. And it was written by Alex Sallheiser and Christoph Richter. And Nicholas Potter is a writer with a focus on right-wing extremism, anti-Semitism, racism, and conspiracy ideologies. And he's an editor and journalist at Bell Tower News, which is a project by the Amadeo Antonio Foundation. And I will give the floor to you.
Thanks, Verena. Thanks for having me. Yeah, in my segment, I would like to talk about the AfD and what's happened with them during the pandemic, but also this huge protest movement we've been seeing in Germany since March last year, and then sort of the effects or the consequences this has had on politics, political discourse, but also a spike in attacks. So first of all, getting to the AfD, I mean, the title of this event is right-wing populism and its effect on the pandemic. I would say that the AfD is a radical right party, obviously with populist elements as well. I think generally what we see with populism is this tendency to offer oversimplified answers to insanely complex problems. And I think that the pandemic is a classic case of that as well. It is a very complicated situation. The good news is, so spoiler alert, the AfD has been unable to really profit from the pandemic politically. The AfD in Germany is usually just it's the largest opposition party. It got 12.6% at the last election in 2017. And as the largest opposition party, it takes its position as an opposition party very, very seriously, to the point where it's just sort of in a permanent, fundamental opposition to anything. So whatever's on the table politically, the AFD is just against it. And we've seen this in the crisis, in the pandemic as well. So the AFD actually initially supported measures to combat the coronavirus pandemic. They initially actually criticized that the measures imposed at the end of March last year came too late. The co-chair of the party, Alice Weidel, said that the government has to take appropriate action now. Jörg Meuthen, who's also chair of the party, said that we need to shut down now. And just a few weeks later, they were questioning whether we really need masks. They were questioning whether we're really in an epidemic emergency, and they were criticizing restrictions on movement. And by the end of April, Alice Weidel was now saying that the economy needs to be restarted immediately. And then they criticized in June that the relaxing of the measures came too late. So, I mean, it's almost comical if it wasn't so serious and tragic. The fact that they're just sort of blindly against anything. So we've seen something similar to what my colleagues in Finland and Sweden have also said, that, for example, the AFD has also tried to capitalize on the pandemic by saying that perhaps migrants are bringing the virus to Germany, that we need to close the borders to deport people. So there is definitely this kind of authoritarianism there as well. But this is a challenge in Germany, because I think that generally people in Germany were fairly supportive of the measures to combat the pandemic. About 87% of the population in total supported the measures, and about 58% of AFD voters. So, I mean, not loads in comparison to the general population, but still a small majority. So what does this mean for the AFD during the pandemic? Well, their polling numbers have actually decreased for a number of reasons, including various conflicts within the party about the direction between far-right extremism and a more right-wing populist conservative approach. So, I mean, they got 12.6% at the last election, and the high point, 2019, they were polling around 15%, but now they're almost down to single digits. So like 9–10% is what they're polling at the moment. So yeah, they're still doing fairly well in East Germany though. So I think the main conclusion from that is that the AFD have sort of been there during the pandemic, trying to make it a topic, but it hasn't really succeeded. Now, at the same time, we've had this huge protest movement in Germany, which is quite worrying. And initially actually started as hygiene demos, and it was actually organized by people who see themselves as more left-wing and critical of capitalism. They're still there, but very quickly, lots of people from the far right were coming to the demos. There was no distancing from these original left-wing organizers, and they're still basically all just marching together alongside. These demos quickly morphed into something we're now calling Querdenken, which I guess you could translate like that's the name of this sort of organization that started in Stuttgart, and now they have lots of offshoots and chapters around Germany. The head of it's Michael Ballweg. And at these demos that we're now going to call Querdenken demos, I guess, they're sort of ostensibly against the pandemic and the measures to control it, but we're seeing that, like I said, it's like a who's who of the far right spectrum. There's lots of esotericists there. We're seeing rampant conspiracy ideologies. We're seeing anti-Semites. We're seeing organized neo-Nazis and far right hooligans, and they've all sort of merged together in this kind of weird, unholy alliance. At the beginning of August last year in Berlin, about 20,000 people came to a demo. By the end of August, it was about 40,000 people. And one of the bizarre things is that in August, I mean, we could go to restaurants again. I mean, everything was more or less open. So I'm not sure entirely how much it actually has to do with the pandemic measures. If you look at their demands, they are actually demanding things which you usually see in the Reichsbürger scene. I'll explain that in a second. So they were demanding a constituent assembly. They were criticizing the occupation law. They were calling for sovereignty of Germany, for a new constitution. And these are basically typical Reichsbürger demands, which is a conspiracy theory in Germany that the German Reich is still intact because there was never a proper peace treaty after the Second World War. And they basically believe that Germany is a limited company. And obviously this conspiracy ideology is very much rooted in the far right spectrum. So if we look at the protests against the pandemic, I would say that this is the major sort of far right and right-wing populist movement we've seen in the last year. The AfD have not really been that welcomely accepted by this protest movement. They failed to really capitalize it, although in August last year, they were also calling to attend this demo. So I think that's the real worrying thing, that we have this similar dynamic. It's kind of like an anti-establishment dynamic that we also saw with the Pegida demonstrations from 2014 onwards. Maybe just two quick examples. So in these demonstrations in August, some of the climax, if you will, was when there were like scuffles and fights broke out in front of the Russian and American embassies. There were conspiracy theories that Donald Trump was going to land in Germany and sort of sort everything out. And then basically a bunch of far-right and Reichsbürger people tried to storm the steps of the Bundestag with their Reichsflaggen, which is the old flag of the German Reich, which caused a lot of media sensation. But I think it's important to stress that this is nothing like the storm of the Capitol in Washington. They didn't actually try to break in. I think it was much more like a PR move than anything, even though symbolically it was very worrying and sad to see. So now I guess to sort of conclude, if we get to the consequences of all of this, what does this actually mean, this big protest movement in Germany that, that somehow has nothing to do with the pandemic and everything to do with it? Because of course some of the biggest demos were at times where the restrictions were the least invasive. And probably it's worth mentioning as well, in comparison to other countries, the lockdown in Germany was always very mild. It wasn't like in France where you need to fill out a form to even leave your house. The consequences, I would say, is a big spike in anti-Semitism and racist attacks in the last year. Anti-Semitism is, like I say, rampant at these demonstrations. People are wearing yellow Jewish stars, like from the Holocaust, saying unvaccinated on them. They're drawing crass parallels. They're saying we live in a dictatorship. They're saying Merkel is Hitler. They're saying that any kind of hygiene act being passed by parliament is some kind of enabling act, like under Hitler. So we're seeing a normalization of far-right symbols and ideas. We're also seeing some new parties. So this could actually be bad news for the AfD at the coming election in September. We're seeing lots of tiny parties like Wir 2020, the Basisdemokratische Partei Deutschland, Aufwachen 2020, Team Freiheit, or Team Freedom. I think none of them have any real chance at all, but they will definitely split the kind of far-right and right-wing populist vote. And perhaps the most worrying trend we're seeing as a consequence of this radicalization of discourse, the effect of these demonstrations, is attacks against a vaccination center in Rostock in the north of Germany in January this year. We saw an arson attack against the Robert Koch Institute, which is Germany's body for disease control. A small explosive device was detonated in Berlin in front of a scientific research institute, and they even left like a note basically criticizing the government's approach to the pandemic. And finally, the other thing is attacks against the press. At several demonstrations, notably in Leipzig in November last year, we saw like journalists are being spat at, their cameras are being ripped out of their hands, they're being punched and kicked on the floor even. At this one demonstration in Leipzig in November last year, there were 43 attacks against journalists. And I think we've now arrived at a climate where covering these demos and covering this movement since the pandemic is actually very dangerous for journalists. And yeah, now I'm finished.
Thank you so much. Thank you all very much for your thought-provoking presentations, and also thanks for being so disciplined time-wise. We now have about 20 minutes for our discussion, and I would also invite the audience and the viewers on Facebook to see if they have any questions that are coming up now that they want to pose to the presenters. If time, as I said before, we can pick them up. For our discussion, I would like to start with just very briefly checking again what the specific of your country is in your view. I think the German part was about obvious right now, but maybe we can hear just briefly what you think is very special about your case. I would start with Nico again, and then Ann-Cathrine, and then Nicholas, if that's okay.
Yes, thanks. I think what's special about the Finnish case is that in the case of the Finns party, it has not suffered any losses in terms of support. And often there's this presupposed connection between populist radical right parties and how they would engage in conspiratorial contents or with movements that act as sponsors for these kinds of ideas. So there hasn't been any connection between the Finns party and the various kind of conspiratorial ideas floating around online. And there's a certain connection between the Finns party not losing any support and the Finns party from refraining from engaging with these kinds of ideas, is that the Finns party has been able to retain its sort of legitimacy in the Finnish parliamentary system. And there are a few reasons also for why I think the Finns party has not engaged in the kinds of activism that the AFD has done in Germany. But maybe we can discuss them later.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be the second part. Ann-Cathrine?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, the specific thing about Sweden is obviously the voluntary strategy and the high number of deaths in compared to the Nordic cases. And since there is a lot of cooperation and contacts between the Nordic countries, I think the Swedish exceptionalism has been highly debated. And the Swedish way of dealing with this situation, I mean, public support has been quite high and over the period for how the public health agency has been dealing with it. And in spite of the fact that they are independent from the executive, individual ministers cannot go in and tell the public health agency how to do. The prime ministers has repeatedly supported the actions taken and the recommendations made. So I think that's kind of, and I think that's very special. And there was a commission set up. All parties supported this, that will investigate how the COVID strategy. And their first report was published. So I think these will be kind of items in the debate to come up. And in a way, they have been siding with a lot of the criticism made by the Sweden Democrats. So I think this pandemic will, as I said in my first intervention, that speed up in a way the normalization of the Sweden Democrats and their, in a way, legitimization. I'm not sure that it will spill over in increased public support for them, since, I mean, those who vote for radical right parties vote for them on their positions on immigration, on the European Union, integration, criminality, and so on. But I think this is and there are kind of connections to the Finnish case, that also the Sweden Democrats, even though they have been criticizing the government, they have also, in a way, tried to establish that we are kind of serious parties, that they have contacts with other mainstream parties, because the aim is obviously, since we have a cross-block coalition, which is quite unique in the Swedish case, in the Swedish situation. There is a kind of a conservative bloc in the making, and the Sweden Democrats will play a major role in that. So I think that's kind of what's special with the Swedish case, and it's about the opportunity structure, the different political opportunity structures in the various countries, depending both on their political trajectories, but also in how they have responded, which strategies they have been taking in relation to the coronavirus.
Thank you. Nicholas, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for Germany, I guess the two things that stick out to me in particular are the warped historical analogies. So the fact that on the one hand, some of the leading figures within this Querdenken anti-pandemic measure movement are open Holocaust deniers and neo-Nazis. But on the other hand, there's a very wide tendency to kind of stylize oneself as the new Jews, as if to say we're in a new dictatorship, and people who don't go along with the measures, who don't want to get vaccinated, are being treated just like the Jews did back then. You see this at almost every single demonstration, and it's incredibly worrying. You're seeing people comparing themselves with Anne Frank, saying that because they couldn't celebrate their birthday party, this is just, they were hiding, and it was just like back then. This is really, really worrying, and this is definitely something that I've noticed. The other bizarre thing is the fact that we kind of have these like I'd say like anti-corona minor celebrities, and I think they've been very influential in the radicalization of a lot of people. So we have this weird category of people. Attila Hildman is probably the most well-known. He used to be like a celebrity, minor celebrity, vegan cooking book author, basically, and now he's basically gone full conspiracy and shares neo-Nazi content on his Telegram channel. But we also have Michael Wendler, who was like a Schlager musician and was a judge on a kind of like pop idol type program. And there's also Oliver Janich. There's a few of them, and each of them has about 150,000 followers on Telegram. They post all day, every day. They're almost like full-time conspiracy influencers. And I think as soon as people sort of go down the rabbit hole, very quickly they end up with QAnon, they end up with Holocaust denial, they end up with things. And so this is a dynamic I've seen in Germany, where there probably are, at least like off the top of my head, 5 to 10 very influential people with big followings on Telegram. And they've been very decisive in how this movement has developed.
Thank you very much. I think we can dive now a bit deeper into the analysis of why this is a bit of a difference, because we can see clearly that, for example, in Germany, there's a different way of normalization. So the AfD or the right-wing parties, the right-wing groups, they seem to be aiming at the normalization in terms of right-wing discourse more towards the center, by being radical and radicalizing the discourse. Whereas in the Nordic countries such as Sweden and Finland, we seem to see that there's an approach of normalization in terms of political, governmental legitimization. So it's more of being a serious member of the parliament. And I would like to discuss a little bit why you think that is. And I think this is also really entangled with the idea of what we also discussed a little bit before, conspirational ideologies. So why is it that, for example, in Germany, the AfD, but also other right-wing groups and parties are trying to capture this movement, whereas in Finland and Sweden, there seems to be a total lack of it, and people don't even want to approach it in a way because it doesn't seem to be proof of success, for example. So I would just like to give that to you, and I think I will just flip the order for now, if that's okay, and I will start with Nicholas and Ann-Cathrine and then Nico.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess this just sort of fits with the AfD's MO generally of being anti-everything, a very anti-establishment party. Like I said, at the beginning of the pandemic, they initially went along with the measures before just sort of turning it around and realizing that they could only maybe profit from this politically by being against it. And I think that they saw that there was a movement emerging that they could maybe try to latch on to. Maybe one interesting anecdote, I was at one of the demonstrations, journalistically, not privately, in summer, and I noticed a lot of posters which they looked like identical to something the AfD would produce, but notably it didn't have the AfD's logo anywhere on it. So it was in the same colors, it was in the same style, so they were sort of like cautiously trying to be there, but I think even they realized that that the sentiment of these demonstrations wasn't necessarily pro-AfD. I think generally they've just struggled to define themselves. I mean, ironically, they've been saying for years, let's close all the borders and stop letting people in. And then the pandemic comes, and it's exactly what the CDU does to get the pandemic under control. And then they're sort of stuck there without their sort of main topic anymore. I think they were just sort of panicking and looking for something that they could sort of make their biggest topic now. And yeah.
So I can continue. Well, I mean, the difference between the two parties in the Nordic countries and the AfD is obviously that the AfD is really marginalized. It's not on its way to the mainstream in any way, since there is no other party that has, at least there was just local council where they were invited to support the government. But I mean, and then they employ this kind of radical strategy because it doesn't give them any costs in terms of moving, being accepted by the other parliamentary parties, but they at least consider that it might increase the number of votes, whereas in the two other Nordic countries, these parties are part of the mainstream. They the Finns party have been part of government, and they foresee that they will in the future be part of the government, and the Sweden Democrats, it's the same, they have not been part in the government. So the pressure on them on acting kind of responsibly is much higher. I think from my point of view, it seems like the German case is much more like the situation in the US, where you have a lot of celebrities, you have a lot of movements, civil society movements, kind of the anti-vaxxers, but also alt-right movements, health groupings criticizing, and siding with Trump. I think there is no coincidence that Trump was so relaxed and slack on the pandemic, because I think there resonates with certain groups within these right conservative movements in that sense. So I think that's I think a comparison between the US and why you have these groups out on the streets in Germany, where you don't find them to the same extent in Finland and Sweden. They are obviously much smaller countries, but still there are groupings. And as I said, there is this kind of overlap because anti-vaxxers, religious groupings also, kind of in the Protestantic environment, that are reluctant to vaccines, but also kind of critical of the COVID thing. So I think we have, like in Germany, many kind of unholy, groupings that we would not expect to cooperate, that resonates and find one another, but they have not the same capacity to mobilize as in the German case. And as you said, if they have the same posters at AFD, maybe there is some kind of stronger mobilization capacity in the German case. And of course, this kind of experience of Pegida, where there have been a lot of actions out in the streets, that now is kind of repeated in this situation, that there is a mobilization capacity that's stronger in the German case than in the Nordic countries.
Yeah, continuing on Ann-Cathrine's point, I definitely think that we should take with a grain of salt all of these propositions of the populist radical right and conspirational ideologies having this automatic connection with each other, as certainly there are sort of elements within, especially the populist elements of the radical right, that make sort of building bridges or discursively connecting the different elements within conspirational ideas and radical right ideas. But these linkages have to be actually discursively made and disseminated, and this tends to take years of time. So I think the differences between Germany and Finland and Sweden point out that there are so many variables in different country contexts that can affect to what extent populist radical or sort of institutional actors partake in conspirational ideas, that it makes it sort of a rather strenuous idea to make the connection automatically. So I think that these kind of conspiration theories could have more pertinence in country context where there is very low science literacy, where people don't tend to trust public officials or their healthcare systems, where and especially where they aren't or where there are very sort of high profile frame sponsors for conspirational thinking, both within party institutions, but also, for example, in the mainstream media, which there have been, for example, in the United States quite prominently. And I think it's also affected to the extent by which the populist radical right parties are ideologically already established, and to what extent also they are organizationally structured. Like, for example, in Finland, sure, the Finns party is a very anti-elitist, anti-establishment party, but it has a very particular kind of an idea of what the elite or who the elite are, and this sort of the green left elite that is domestically prominent in the Finnish radical right rhetoric isn't very prominent in the sort of globalist conspiracy that has been sort of suggested to be central to the COVID-19 conspiracies. Also, organizationally, you could argue that in some parties where sort of communication control is a lot less centralized, than in the Finns party, it could be a relevant train of thought to think that they would adopt more radical stances more quickly. Whereas compared to, for example, the AFD, where the local municipal or local chapters in the party have even led these protests together with sort of party adjacent actors. In the Finns party, if one of the sort of 240 municipal associations would join the extra parliamentary far right in protesting, they would quite quickly get a call from party office saying, "What the hell are you guys doing? Stop it right away." So I think we, before putting any linkages between radical right and conspiracy theories, we have to consider all of these different variables that have an effect in different country contexts, to what extent they are sort of equivalent with each other.
Thank you so much, Nico. Is there, Ann-Cathrine or Nicholas, do you want to add something to this analysis?
Well, I could just, I think Nico pinpointed one important aspect. I mean, the Nordic countries are high trusting societies. I mean, we trust our institutions and we trust democracy, and so I think that's also kind of a vaccine, or provides immunity for conspiracy theories in a way. I think that's important to keep in mind. But and it's quite surprising that the support of the governments and their actions have been so high in both also in Sweden, where the death rate has been quite high. So I think that's also worth to keep in mind when trying to compare the different countries and their populations and the reactions towards the governmental practices.
And on the flip side, I would add from the German perspective, once again, this anti-elite, anti-establishment rhetoric. I mean, I would argue that we're seeing with the Querdenken anti-corona measure protests a very similar political dynamic than what we saw with Pegida from 2014 onwards against migration to Germany. And as I explained in my piece earlier as well, I think that a lot of the demands of this Querdenken demo actually have very little to do concretely with the pandemic. So I would say that this is something that will be around for a while, and presumably as the infection rates go down, as people get vaccinated even after the pandemic, I think a movement has been born here that won't just disappear as soon as the pandemic gets under control, and that's worrying. Especially because, and now to the second point, the thing that really alarms me is the speed at which people have become radicalized. We've seen this in the USA as well. If you look at a lot of the people storming the Capitol, but also if you look at this from a German perspective, these are people who, like a year ago, weren't really that politically involved, and they've somehow, usually it takes years to get to the stage where you start like attacking journalists and setting fires and things like this. But what we've seen is in the space of a few months, people have become radicalized to the point where they're willing to use violence to achieve their aims. And I think this is one of the most alarming things, especially because I fear that this movement won't simply fizzle out as the pandemic gets better.
Thank you so much for your additions. We only have 2 minutes left, but I would like to emphasize one question from a viewer, just very briefly to whoever wants to answer this. A question from the viewer is, I have seen that the Swedish flag has also been flown in the Querdenken demonstrations. What is your analysis of how different government strategies has led to different approaches from the far right? Who wants to?
Well, I can start, and I think Nicholas will know more, but I think also in the US that I've been following more closely, and those groupings who have been kind of siding with Trump, that kind of downplaying the dangers with COVID, they have often taken the Swedish case as the example to follow. I mean, they have been doing rightly, they have not closed down, and so on. So I think Sweden, at least initially, Sweden was kind of the model case for those who were critical of strong measures against COVID.
At the Querdenken demos, we saw lots of different kinds of flags. I mean, you could probably write books analyzing it. I mean, I also saw some Swedish flags as well. It makes sense. They look to one country where they can sort of say, look, everything's fine there. They obviously sort of ignored that things didn't exactly go amazingly with the Swedish strategy. But for example, at these Querdenken demos, despite the anti-Semitism I mentioned, I also saw Israel flags. Despite lots of things, US flags were also fairly ubiquitous, as well as peace flags, rainbow flags, as well as Nazi flags. So I mean, interpreting any kind of logic into there as to why these people do the things they do, I mean, it was full of contradictions.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is already up. It was very dense, but also deep conversation. So, and I think it's pretty obvious that there's a lot more to say. So I will hope that you will join us for further events on this topic, and that you will download all the papers that are available. And I'm also very happy that we will now have also time for a concluding remark by Håkan Bengtsson, who is a Swedish journalist, author, and debater with a focus on Swedish politics. And he's also the executive director of the progressive think tank and publishing house Arena Gruppen. Some of his major interests are British and German social democratic movements and the development of the trade union movement. So I will say goodbye for now and hand over the mic to Håkan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for interesting papers and presentations. It's for us very important to have this cross-border update and exchange of experience, and of course a special thank to FES for the role you play in the Nordic countries for us. It's also easy to see how many challenges are the same in our countries. Even though the right-wing populist party is not a uniform party family, actually, it's easy to see some common elements like anti-immigration, ethno-nationalism, anti-European Union, etc., nationalism in terms of that sovereignty on the national level always overrules international cooperation, etc. But listening to the discussion and the papers, it's interesting to see that the right-wing front seems to be a bit divided in terms of COVID, and just a reflection on that. In my world, I think the right-wing populist movement is actually a mixture of traditional conservative views from before democracy, and at the same time neoliberal and libertarian stance. Or at least elements. So and anti-state position, anti-establishment, like Nicholas talked about, at least so as long as the state is in their world ruled by left libertarian views. So maybe this is also a reason why the right-wing populist movement and the parties in this field has taken different stance on the corona. In some countries, more anti-lockdown, more state restrictions, etc. And in other parts of this movement, like in UK, I think, and also in Germany, and of course in the US, it's more libertarian and challenging the view of the strategy, etc. So maybe this is also the right-wing populist dilemma and their ability to adapt to whatever discontent there is in the world, and it's hard to be. The notion of Sweden is that was a very libertarian approach on corona. So it's easy to see that it's used, and it's hard for right-wing populists to use it as an example in Sweden. So they've been even more locked down in their approach to this. But I think we all feel this corona fatigue at the moment. And of course, corona has created fear. It's a deadly disease for many people. But I think Nicholas talked about this, the radicalization. I think in a way we see it in Sweden as well. The fake news, the conspiracy theories is gaining ground. And for example, I mean, we have death threats to civil servants. It's also in Sweden. Some researchers who won't go into this field because of threats, etc. This kind of milieu could develop in any direction. I agree with Ann-Cathrine that it's not sort of leftish or right-wing. It's people engage in this, but it could be used also for the right-wing populist. And it's a really mixed picture, I would say. And it's easy to see that in other countries, and in general, it's been used and it's expression of a right-wing milieu in many ways, this fake news approach. Some concluding remarks then. If you talk, we can talk about the short term, but also we need to talk about a long-term effect of corona. We still live in the aftermath of the financial crisis, and corona is an even deeper crisis, also even deeper economic effects on us. On the short run, the right-wing populists lost voters. In a way, you can also say that it was the left who sort of set the agenda. It was the return of the state as a safe haven in this crisis, which was necessary to tackle the challenges we were facing. At the same time, it's also the case that corona is a challenge for the globalization we have seen, which part of the progressive side also been adopting in recent decades. We see closed borders, more focus on the national level, etc. So this is really not only about discussing the right-wing populist challenge, it's also about the need for the progressives to adopt to a strategy in this totally new situation. And we also need a discussion about that. But that's the theme for the next seminar, I would say. I would just like to say very much that it was an interesting and important discussion, and the discussion goes on. A special thanks, of course, to Nico at Kalevi Sorsa Foundation, and Nico for your presentation, and Ann-Cathrine and Nicholas and Verena, sorry, for excellent moderation. So thank you very much also to you who listened and post questions on Facebook. Maybe we can go in and comment some of the comments later. So thank you very much.